Erev Tov Rabotai, we are continuing with our Mishna Yomi Masechet Terumot. We are up to Perek Aleph Mishnah Yud. Today's Mishnah should be Leil Mishmat, Neria ben Svedlana Aranbayev, and Eliyahu ben Brucha Menuchatam Began Eden. Amen. The Mishnah now will tell us the rule that lies behind many of these laws that we spoke about in this chapter. En tormin midavar shenigmera melachto al davar shelo nigmera melachto. We may not separate terumah from something whose processing is finished for something whose processing is not finished. And we may not separate terumah from something whose processing is not finished for something whose processing is finished. And we may not separate terumah from something whose processing is not finished for something whose processing is not finished. Rather, we may separate terumah only from processed produce for other processed produce. Now, different types of produce have different points at which they are considered processed. For example, the processing of grain is complete when after the kernels have been stacked into a pile, the pile is smoothened down. It's called neruach hakeri. Ve'im tarmu terumatan terumah, but if people did separate terumah either from or for unprocessed produce, their terumah is valid. An exception to this rule we learned in Mishnah Dalet, which taught that if olives were designated as terumah for olive oil or grapes as terumah for wine, the designation is not effective, and you have to look at Mishnah 8, how we spoke about, because it's detrimental to the Kohen. Really, the Kohen should be given olive oil, you're giving him olives, you're giving him more work, therefore the Chachamim invalidated it. That is going to botai of Perek Aleph Mishnah Yud. We begin with Perek Bet Mishnah Aleph. Now, Rabotai, when terumah is designated, it must be touching or near the produce for which it's being designated. This is called Mina Mukaf, the law of proximity. Now, in general, the law of proximity, Mina Mukaf, requires only that the two items be near each other. It's not necessary for them to actually touch. However, if one item is tameh and one is tahor, the law of proximity is not fulfilled unless they are touching. Now, this would have to be done in a way that the tahor produce does not become tameh, and that you're going to have to see. We're going to speak about it later on. Now, where the law of proximity was not fulfilled, you didn't fulfill Mina Mukaf. The terumah's designation, although it's forbidden, is valid after the fact. And for this, you look in the Rambam, Terumot, chapter 3, Halacha 17. The Mishnah now presents ruling based on this law of Mina Mukaf, the law of proximity. And tormin mitar al tameh. We may not separate terumah from tahor produce for tameh produce. This is asur because the rabbis were concerned that one who designates tahor produce as terumah for tameh produce will violate the law of proximity Mina Mukaf by keeping them apart, for fear that the tameh produce will make the tahor produce tameh. V'im tarmu terumatan terumah. But if people did separate terumah from tahor produce for tameh produce, their terumah is valid. Be'emet amru, in truth, the Chachamim said, which the Mefarshim explain, this expression introduces a ruling that is regarded as though if it was taught to Moshe Rabbeinu at Sinai, in the sense that it's clear and unquestionable. This is brought down in Derech Emunah Al Terumot, chapter 5, number 63. Now the Mishnah says again, Be'emet amru, in truth, the Chachamim said, Ha'igul shel devela shenitma mikzato. If part of a round cake of pressed fig became tameh and part of it remained tahor. Now the Rav says, although the figs in the cake are pressed together, they are considered separate items with respect to the laws of tumah. Therefore, if only some of the figs become tameh, they don't necessarily contaminate all the figs. So, ha'igul shel devela shenitma mikzato, if part of a round cake of pressed figs became tameh and part of it remained tahor, one may separate terumah from the tahor figs that are in it for the tameh figs that are in it, meaning there's no concern that a person will transgress Mina Mukaf, the law of proximity, because the tahor and tameh figs are already touching each other. Similarly, if one has a bundle of vegetables or a pile of produce, of which some is tameh and some is tahor, one is allowed to designate tahor items as terumah for the tameh items because they're already touching each other. But if there were two round cakes of pressed figs, or two bundles of vegetables, or two piles of produce, and one of them is tameh and one of them is tahor, one may not separate terumah from this one for that one, because since these are distinct items, he might indeed keep them apart, which would violate mina mukaf, the law of proximity. Rabbi Eliezer says, Tormin mina tahor ala tameh. One may separate terumah from produce that is tahor from produce that is tahor, for produce that is tameh in all cases. Meaning, according to Rabbi Eliezer, the Chachamim did not prohibit separation of this type out of concern; they would keep them apart. He even allows, if you have 2 round cakes of pressed figs, or 2 bundles of vegetables, or 2 piles of produce, and one is tameh and one is tahor, to separate the terumah from the tahor for the tameh. The Rab does tell us, and Rabbi Eliezer, the Halacha does not follow Rabbi Eliezer, the Halacha follows the Chachamim. That is in Rabotai, today's Mishna Yomi. Baruch Adonai Leolam, Amen v'Amen.